Welcome to Mid-Level Adventurers, a podcast where non-experts talk about the things they love. I'm Jarrod, and with me for this first series is my co-host, Matt Morris.
Hello everyone, it's Matt Morris.
D&D is a game built on magic and fantasy. Last week we began our delve into magic, and barely were able to scratch the surface on the source of magic and spells and such arcane things. Get it? This week we go in search of those most sought-after pieces of game lore, magical items. The iconic flaming sword, the bag of holding, and the ring of invisibility. These items just barely scratch the possibilities that abound within the game. What treasures lie beneath? Let's dive into that magical money bin. So, I've named a couple, but what are magic items, and where do they come from, and what possible purpose could they serve, besides just being cool?
Well, magic items are, given my definition of magic last week, this is going to go well. Magic items can be what would otherwise look like a normal, mundane item that has been imbued with magic properties. So it has additional properties maybe, or it might be stronger, like a sword that has higher damage, or maybe an amulet that allows you to breathe underwater, or gives you protection from physical damage or spells. As far as where they come from, I'm not going to be able to give a good answer for that. Unfortunately, I'll have to I'll let Jarrod do a little more explaining on that. But purposes they serve, I would say that's wild and varied. I've used very little in my actual gameplay so far, but it's not always about flaming swords. Sometimes there are some cool utility-based magic items that I'm excited to talk about. So I'm going to turn that back to you, Jarrod. You might better answer the question, where do magic items come from?
Well, first of all, let me just say, you hit the nail right on the head with what are magic items.
Oh, good.
Yeah. In 5th edition specifically, magic items are generally considered pretty rare and wonderful, mostly due to the time it takes to enchant them.
Yes.
In certain official realms, it can be more of a plot storyline thing. In 5th edition, it takes the position that magic items take a long time to create, so therefore there aren't too many of them.
Correct. We touched on that a little bit last time.
We did. Thus why magic shops that once dominated entire cities on a plane are now much rarer, and the items they contain are more expensive. But you can also ignore that and do whatever you want if you're the DM. Some magic items can be actually made custom. You can have someone craft it if you can find a person who knows how and get the materials. And maybe that's part of a little mini quest. You know, in order to forge a pendant of poison protection, they need to find a giant scorpion or a yuan ti and get the poison gland from those creatures. You know, it could be anything. They can be relics or old items that are part of a treasure hoard, or they can be something that has been sold off from either a needy or retired adventurer. There's always going to be a trade in magical items. Mm-hmm. If you got something fancy, someone else probably wants it.
Oh, yeah.
And if you have one fancy thing, you might want another.
That's true, too. You might happen upon the occasional fancy thing that might have a cursed property and you want to get rid of.
That is also true. Not every magical item is nice, and some are even sentient.
Ah, yes.
Which means that some magical items have their own agenda, and you may think you know what it is, but you might not.
That's true. And do these sentient magical items sort of have a hand in choosing who is in possession of them from time to time?
A lot of them can, yes. For example, Azure Edge is a battle axe in the Forgotten Realms that if you are not a lawful good creature, it probably won't even let you carry it. And it has the ability to just drop to the ground and stay there and not be picked up.
Ah, it's very Thor's hammer, isn't it?
Very much. It's very Mjolnir. You were right also in that magic items can definitely be helpful in combat, +1 sword, flaming sword, whatever. Or they can buff your abilities, like a Cloak of Protection, which gives you +1 to your defenses. Or they can give you extra abilities, like perhaps you're not someone who could normally cast magic, but you have a ring that lets you cast a spell once per day. It could be something way more utilitarian, like a backpack that turns into a tent over the course of 5 minutes.
Yeah, and it's nice to have those things. Like I said earlier, you don't always need the flaming sword. Sometimes it's cool to have these utility-based things that are just make your travels a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But I feel like asking where magic items come from is kind of a bigger question. I think you start approaching the history of magic items in D&D, like the legacy, the idea of where these things come from. And in D&D, magic items have been around since the 1st edition and are pretty intrinsic to the game. Since the game was based largely off of Tolkien's Fellowship of the Rings, there's a lot of magic items in those books. Some notable favorites that have been around forever in D&D. There's the Bag of Holding, there's the Portable Hole, there's the Ring of Invisibility, and the ever-prominent Healing Potion.
Probably the most important magic item of all.
Probably the most sought after, strangely enough.
Yes.
You think it might be a legendary weapon of some kind, but nope, everybody always wants those healing potions. But you have your bag of holding, which is the size of a regular bag, but you can put so much more stuff into it. It's the TARDIS on your belt. It's bigger on the inside.
There are a few rules and stipulations about what you can put in it, if I'm not mistaken, but for the most part, kind of defies logic how much you can carry around in that thing.
Yeah. Funnily enough, one of the other notable favorites is indeed the portable hole, and if you put a portable hole in a bag of holding, you can cause an interdimensional tear in the fabric of reality.
Oh, don't tell Grieg that.
That's true. They may want to see it just to see it. But there are also artifacts that have been in numerous editions. The Sword of Kos, the Hand and the Eye of Vecna, Black Razor, the Book of Vile Darkness, the Black Staff, the Ring of Winter. There's just so many iconic magical items that have been created that they have achieved artifact status, and they permeate D&D lore, history, editions, and you can have multiple campaigns just searching for a single item as it changes hands over and over again throughout the ages. And there have been entire books that they have published as source books that are just filled with magical items. Just page after page of magical items that your characters could find and use to do pretty much anything.
Yeah, I like the idea of the quest for the legendary artifact status magic weapons. I mean, I think it's definitely an in-game sort of moment in your campaign. But yeah, when your characters get to a certain level of strength or whatever, perhaps that is just as exciting to go out and hunt for the lost sword of whatever. And as a DM, the limit is your imagination how this magic item might find its way into your campaign, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And perhaps it is something like it is a legendary quest and everybody adventures for it, and that's the dream, is to find that thing. But it could also be that maybe it's a red herring and it's really just designed to get people to look for it.
That's true too. Interesting plot points.
Or it could be that the item is not entirely what you think it is.
Maybe it is cursed.
Yeah. Its true purpose could have been corrupted over centuries or forgotten about.
And the idea, too, that some of these items last so long, like through the ages, and become sort of artifacts, is tied to, I would imagine, how difficult it is to destroy a truly magical weapon.
Right.
It takes so long to create one, so much goes into it, that I imagine it probably takes that much, if not more, to destroy one. So it makes sense that they would be present through the ages.
Yes, which also extends from first edition and Tolkien's The One Ring. You had to throw it in the heart of a very specific volcano that it was forged in. So destroying magical items can be a quest in and of itself, whether it's a cursed one or not. It can be very difficult to destroy one, which is fun.
Yeah.
If you have this item that won't let go of you, you have to get rid of it. You have to figure out how to do that. And that's a whole quest line right there.
Of course. But obviously, there are more magic items that are not the sort of legendary artifact status that are just as cool to find, just as cool to use.
Yeah.
And would be something that your characters would start to find, hopefully, as they progress in levels through your DM's campaign.
Oh, absolutely. Probably one of my favorite items in 5th edition is the Cloak of Billowing.
I'm not actually familiar with that one.
It is a common magical item, so it costs around 75, 100 gold, depending on how much you can barter it for. All it is it's a regular cloak that you wear, but with a bonus action, you can command it to billow dramatically behind you, regardless of the wind. So it's an epic hero moment cape.
That's pretty awesome.
And that's all it does. It doesn't offer any booster protections or give you any abilities. It just looks cool.
Yeah, and that's so fun.
Somebody has spent their time crafting, stitching this cloak, and imbuing it with this certain bit of magic.
Yeah.
And that's awesome.
In the right character's hands, or around the right character's shoulders, that's going to be pretty epic.
Oh, yeah.
And just because it's a, quote, common magic item does not mean, like you said, it's any less fun or interesting or exciting to find.
Oh, yeah. Well, that kind of brings up the next question, the different types of magical items, right? Because rarity is a concept that's been around for a while in Dungeons & Dragons. But in 5e, there are 5 different tiers. You've got your common items, your uncommon items, then your rare items, then your very rare items, and then your legendary items.
Gotcha.
There is, however, also a 6th tier.
Oh.
And artifacts belong in that. Artifacts are in their own separate column because there is only ever one of them, and they are so priceless that it is impossible to put a gold cost on it.
Yeah, not that you would buy it in a store anyway.
Right, you're not going to find something like the Sword of Kos in a merchant store.
Right. I can't imagine that if you gained it, you would want to part with it anyway.
Well, it depends on who you are, but yeah. The Sword of Kos, of course, is the sword that stabbed out the eye and cut off the hand of the would-be god, maybe not god, maybe god, Vecna. Kaz was his vampire lieutenant, I believe, that
Gotcha.
attempted to betray Vecna. And his sword gives you a variety of powers and abilities, so you may want them, you may not. The prices range depending on that. Common items usually fall in the 100 to 500 range. Uncommon ones are in the 500 to 5,000 range. Rare items, 5,000 to maybe 50,000. Very rare, 50,000 to 500,000. And legendary items are worth at least a whopping 500,000 gold pieces.
Oof.
But these are prices that are listed in the DMG as kind of a general somewhere in this range. So there's a lot of play and wiggle room there. However, in old editions, certain items had specific values attributed to them. Like, you can get this for 325 gold. That is not the case in 5e because they want to give DMs a guideline as opposed to a list of rules. So you can play with it. Maybe your PCs negotiate really well, or maybe they don't. And so the seller or whoever has it jacks up the price.
That's true.
Or maybe the person they're trying to sell it to knows how much they could get for it somewhere else, and so they try to really lowball them.
It could be, too, that the economy of your campaign setting is just different.
Oh, yeah. It could be that people just don't have the gold to purchase and trade these kind of things. Like, there may be some items that just nobody could ever deal with it. Like, maybe you are in a campaign recovering from an economic collapse, or you're in a society that doesn't really value magical items and views them all with distrust.
Yeah.
And utility items like a bag of holding doesn't really have any major combat abilities, as we've discussed. But weapons are kind of their own separate thing, and they can deal additional damage in a variety of types. They can add a simple +1, or they can apply different types of damage. Like, they could add a die of radiant or fire damage, or they can even change shape sometimes. You're only limited by what you can find or by what your DM can create, so it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's exciting, too, to think that following the guidelines in the DMG, your DM can sort of add some surprises, some magical items of various rarities sprinkled about that you may have never even heard of.
Yeah. One fun little feature we like to do here on Middle Level Adventures is our Tavern Corner, where we go and we talk about what we are imbibing this evening. So, Matt, what are you imbibing tonight?
Tonight, I am imbibing a delicious porter. So another dark beer. Not quite as dark as some of the ones I've tried in the past. Yeah, it's delicious. It's from Hill Farmstead. It's called Everett. I don't know who it's named after. But yeah, it's delicious. It's one of the best porters I think I've honestly ever had. These guys, Hill Farmstead, they make some amazing stuff. They're local-ish, right? They're not New York-based.
Yeah, it sounds like a very New England-style name, Everett.
Yeah, it is. A little thing about me and porters, I'm not always the biggest fan of porters, to be honest. I really like stouts and dark beers, but porters sometimes just fall in this realm of, I want it to be more. I want it to either be stronger and be a stout or just be a different beer. I don't know. But this one hits all the marks. It's not too heavy. It's got the right amount of toasty, chocolatey kind of coffee notes that are, not too heavy. And it comes in this big 25-ounce can because I got a crowler. So I've got my hands full, but it's delicious. So how about you, Jared? What you imbibing tonight?
Tonight, I have gone back to Hawaii to Kona Brewing Company, but this time I have the Big Wave Golden Ale. Golden ales are kind of hit or miss for me, strangely enough, as well. Sometimes they have a bit too much of a pull, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think so.
This one definitely has a pull, but it's not super, super strong. It is definitely a bit hoppy, but it's not overly bitter either. So it's pretty smooth given all that. There's still definitely a bit of a twang, but I enjoyed their longboard. And I've kind of been eyeing the Golden Ale ever since then, but kind of haven't gotten there yet. But I figured, why not go for it? So I did, and it's been enjoyable. But yeah, I like it. The Big Wave Golden Ale from Kona Brewing Company.
Here we stand on kind of opposite ends, right? Jared's got a beer kind of holding out the last few drops of summer sunshine as the fall inevitably rolls in. And I'm like, bring on the cold weather. I'm going to drink the dark stuff. Oh, also, Vermont. That's where they are. Hill Farmstead's in Vermont.
That makes total sense to me.
Well, cheers.
Cheers. Clink.
Clink.
And that's what we're imbibing tonight. What kind of magical items have you encountered in games that you've played, and what ones do you want?
Ooh. Well, that's a good question. The ones I've encountered so far have been a little limited, but granted the level of my characters, that's understanding. One that we've mentioned that came up very recently is the magical tent that within 5 minutes goes from a backpack to a 20-foot by 20-foot, right? Is it a square?
Yep.
Tent, which is quite large. It's a big tent. All by saying some magic words in Draconic. You probably should be careful when and where you are when you say them, as we've tested out as our characters. That one's very fun. Another one that I had some fun with in a different campaign was a movable rod. I almost forgot the name. Which was quite interesting to find, and both my character and me as a player, when we found it, didn't know how it worked, so there was a bit of a comical roleplay segment where we're all trying to figure out what this thing is good for. And
yeah, there's a button.
Yes, yeah. Only for somebody to come up and be like, this is how it works. But it's quite cool. Look it up if you're not totally sure if you've ever heard of it. But and it's kind of an odd thing, I guess. I don't know if it comes up very often, but it's, basically you mash a button on the top of the rod, and wherever you put it, it stays. And I think you need a DC 30 strength check to even move it.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
I guess it's not completely immovable, technically, mechanically speaking. But yeah, it can hold things down, or maybe keep a door closed, or some other things like that. So this definitely falls under the utility.
If you've ever watched Critical Role, there's a time when Sam Riegel uses a immovable rod against a dragon while in flight.
Oh, spoiler alert.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens, but it is hilarious and brilliant, and I highly recommend it.
Okay, I'll have to go catch up on that episode, because now I want to know. Definitely an object that rewards creativity, so I think it's fun when things like that come up.
Right.
How about you? What are some that you've used, or maybe some that you've bestowed upon your party members?
Well, I've seen quite a lot in my times, because I have a tendency to buy the books and then just read through them and be like, that's a cool idea, that's a great weapon, or that's a cool magic thing. I really want a really cool magical sword for my gnome in my Waterdeep campaign. He has a silvered longsword, but it needs an upgrade. I think I want him to get a Vorpal longsword.
Vorpal.
Yeah, probably won't happen. It's a +3 weapon, and if you crit, there's a possibility you can chop the head off of an enemy.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Another cool one that I really like is the Sword of Life Stealing, which on a crit, you regain 10 hit points, and they take an additional 10 necrotic damage. So the flavor is it sucks their life out and gives it to you.
That's cool.
And also, the Frost brand weapons are a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, do tell.
Yeah, they deal another d6 of cold damage. They also grant the user resistance to fire. In freezing temperature, it sheds light in a certain radius. And using it, you can put out non-magical fire.
Oh, very cool.
So those are ones that I would love for him to get. Any one of those, if possible.
It's good to have some wants, though, I think. And I didn't answer that question specifically, because I don't know if I have any specific, I want the sword of blah-de-blah.
Sure.
But I would like some cool items. It depends on the character, right? For my turtle, something like a magic mace or even a magic shield might be really cool. Something that grants some extra strength might be, or speed, that might be kind of funny.
See this turtle zipping around the battlefield.
Yeah. Nothing very specific yet, but I think that's the cool thing about magic items is the more you find and learn what's out there. If your party members are starting to get cool things, and suddenly you're like, oh, I want a cool thing, And I don't know. I just kind of like the sort of excitement and the potential for when they might show up in the campaign if your DM is benevolent and sprinkles them about.
And it should be mentioned that in 5th edition, there are some items that require what is called attunement, which means you spend time bonding with the weapon, more or less.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Some magical weapons require that, some magical suits of armor, some magical items, some rings, some wands, but you can only attune to 3 magical items at any given time.
Ah, are you allowed to wear more than 3? I actually don't know this. Are you allowed to wear more than 3 if some of them do not have an attunement requirement?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know if that was mechanically their way of keeping you from being godlike.
Oh no. For example, you can have 2 +1 daggers, a +1 sword, and a +1 longbow without any problem because none of those items require attunement.
Okay, that's good to know.
However, other magical weapons, such as the Frost brand weapon, does require attunement because of all the benefits it gives.
Gotcha.
What kind of items are your favorite versus your least favorite? I really love these funny, silly items, like the backpack. But I also love really cool weapons. I love items that can really help a character out, like a ring of mind shielding, a cloak of protection, and even a bag of devouring is a lot of fun. I don't think there is a bad magical item.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What are your favorites or least favorites?
Well, not to copy you, I would say I agree, though. I find it fun and humorous when there are quirky magical items, or just some really interesting utility-style ones. The backpack is a great example. There's another one that maybe doesn't seem so amazing on the surface, but the decanter of endless water, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
Less worrying about that. Things like that. But also, yeah, some really cool, awesome weapons.
Right.
I don't know if I really have any least favorites. Even the most mundane, for lack of a better term, magic item is still useful.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you think about, like, hey, would you rather have a +1 dagger or just a regular dagger? Well, the +1 dagger every time. Sure, it's not the most legendary magic item, but
it's magic, and it will overcome creatures who have resistance to non-magical damage.
Thank you. Yes, I forgot to mention that earlier. That is just a simple, even like we said last week, or the week before, I don't remember now, with spells and shillelagh, turning it into a magic stick. Sure, a magic stick may not sound so exotic, but it makes it a magic weapon, and there are certain creatures that you can now attack that would otherwise be impervious to non-magical damage. So that is really cool, too.
Yes, there are many creatures, and not all of them are high level. Some of them are very low level, that are resistant to magical damage, which means if you would hit them for 10 without a magic weapon, you really only hit them for 5.
Yeah, and that can be, oh man, that can be a long fight.
Yeah, so being able to actually damage these types of creatures with even a dagger is a big deal. It certainly helps a lot.
Oh yeah, as we found out the hard way fighting a vampire.
Well, you know.
They can also heal themselves. That's a whole other thing.
Yes, that is a whole nother ball of wax.
I guess least favorite might be, and I haven't personally encountered these, but I'm sure it is not outside the realm of possibility, but items that might have some drawbacks to them, or penalties, or curses, whatever you want to call them. I'm sure there are magic items that exist that have stipulations to them. I think that would be a bit of a bummer to find, only in the sense of, like, suddenly you're making this choice between, how do I take this hit to this to get this strength? But I don't know, is that a common thing in the world of 5e, actually? Or would just be more of a homebrewed?
Certainly curses are a thing in 5th edition. There are cursed weapons.
We found one in my Pathfinder campaign that was a short sword that on the surface just had better damage and was magical. But the drawback, as we found out, was the more you killed with it, the more it could create a bloodlust in the user. And I honestly don't know actually if that one was homebrewed or not. I didn't look it up, but it was pretty interesting because it wasn't so apparent at first what the potential drawback could be.
Yeah, well, the same thing happened in my home game for 5e. I mentioned previously that they had defeated the rogue's mad, insane paladin brother. Well, he had a fancy maul, and so the paladin took the maul to use as a weapon. What he didn't know was that, yes, the maul was amazing and did ridiculous damage. It also drove him slowly mad. Which there came a point when it was like, okay, he's had this thing for long enough, it started working. So you notice that everyone in town has a winged snake just kind of wrapped around their arm, resting their head on the shoulders.
It's pretty cool.
What do you mean everyone? I'm like, everyone except you and your friends has one of these snakes wrapped around their arm. And they're okay with that? They don't seem to mind at all. They don't even seem to acknowledge the snake. And so he mentions it to the people in the party, and I'm like, you guys don't know what he's talking about. They thought because he's a nature paladin, it has to do with his god.
Sure.
Later on, he kept hearing things that weren't there. He kept seeing things that were strange. Then there came a point where the sky was red after he came out of a shop. And then when they left town, it was like, the road lies before you all, except for you. Instead of a nice cobblestone road leading from the city, you see a road lined with skulls.
Wow.
And he was like, okay, so guys, I think this weapon is driving me insane. We should do something about it. And here's the fun thing. When he tried to break the attunement, he had to make a saving throw. If he failed, he would take a buttload of damage, and the attunement would not break. If he did succeed, which he did, then he would only take half of that buttload of damage, but then be driven crazy and just start attacking everything in sight around him until he could no longer do it.
Oh, man.
So in the middle of the road, he starts smashing into his friends, and they had to deal with that.
Yeah, had to put him down probably. Well, temporarily.
They took care of it very efficiently and very quickly, so good for them.
Yeah.
Good on them for that.
Well, and it's probably worth mentioning, jumping off of that not every weapon you pick up, or magical item, is going to have all of the features, written on the hilt, right? Not everything's going to be apparent. So if you wanted to learn more about the magical properties, there are ways to do that, of course, right? But it takes some time, and you actually have to, make a point to...
There are. But here's fun things about that. Normally, when you attune to an item, you figure out what it does. That is the point of spending that time with that item.
Sure.
So that will tell you what your sword does. But attunement does not reveal if an item is cursed, nor does the identify spell.
Oh, that I didn't know. I actually thought that might have pointed it out.
Yeah, most people think the identify spell will tell them if an item is cursed.
Shame on me.
Not true. It does not.
Well, that's kind of fun and scary.
Yeah.
Everything you pick up. I'd be real suspicious playing with Jarrod. Just kidding.
My players are. They are paranoid all the time.
Do I want to put this ring on?
There are ways in which it can be divined. Perhaps a high enough cleric would be able to cast something that would reveal the curse. Depending on the item, if there has been a curse placed upon the item, it is possible for it to be removed by a spell called Remove Curse. However, Remove Curse will not work on most cursed items. There's a difference between a curse that has been placed on an item and a cursed item.
I see.
Imagine like a curse placed on an item to be a secondary effect that some angry spellcaster put on it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas an item that is cursed might have been something that was forged from 1,000 unfulfilled vengeances.
I see.
And so by its nature, it is a cursed weapon. That's part of its identity.
I feel like that is a pretty good description of the short sword we found in the Pathfinder game, just to use an example. Because I think there was something in its past, and how it was created that lent itself to driving the user, the wielder, to a bloodlust the more it used it.
Yeah, that sort of thing is very common for a lot of cursed weapons, things that drive the wielder to commit more and more bloodshed or further atrocities or be more ruthless in battle and just slowly, subtly change the direction that a person goes.
Yeah. It's worth realizing that the longer you're adventuring and the more you come into contact with higher ranked magic items, the more interesting they might become.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, speaking of interesting things, let's talk about homebrewed items. We've kind of mentioned them in passing. We've talked about the backpack that we have in Newly Forged. We've talked about the maul that I made for my home game. What other homebrewed items have you interacted with or do you think are cooler that you've heard about that are interesting?
Well, I probably have mentioned all the ones that I have interacted with personally. Actually, did I ask you this already? Is that tent a homebrew item, or is it just one I don't know about?
It is a homebrewed item.
That's what I thought. Okay. So there you go. The tent, which we've brought up multiple times now. Yeah, I don't think I've got any new ones that I haven't mentioned. They might be part of my favorite kind of magic item. It's just, because there can always be something unique and exciting.
And it can be tailored to a player character as well.
That's very true. Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier, meant to mention that, like, the possibility of having items that might be either tailored to you if you're a religious character, perhaps, maybe something that, has divine magic from your god, or it's very, specific to your class. No, I haven't really encountered a plethora yet, so I'd be interested to hear about more that you have maybe custom made for your campaigns.
Well, I have created some things that I really like. For example, there is a set of dice that I've created that you can use that may potentially deal damage to an enemy, but also, depending on the roll, might deal damage to you. I have created a little magical statue that will remove a condition from any creature who is attuned to it overnight.
Ah, very cool. These are nice little gifts, aren't they, from the DM when you've got maybe a particularly difficult campaign coming up?
Sometimes they're just fun little things that you create. I have created bracers of the sea, so they give you a swim speed of 30 feet. You can breathe underwater for an hour per day, as if you had drunk a potion of underwater breathing. And they give you a +2 bonus to damage and attack rolls made with tridents specifically.
Ooh, that's really cool. I think I want that for my turtle character now that you mention it. He doesn't have a swim speed, so that would be helpful.
Another thing that I am personally fond of is I created a whip that creates a psychic connection with the creature attuned to it, and it grants a +1 bonus to all charisma ability checks and saving throws. It changes its physical appearance to whatever the wielder's subconscious guides it to. But here's my favorite part about this weapon. It has a name. It is named Cool.
Cool. All right. Cool whip. Nice. Obviously the spelling is different, right?
Nope.
Oh, it's not! And of course they have to roleplay lists like they've never heard Cool Whip before.
There are a few other kind of things that I'm particularly fond of. I will say it is hard to balance a homebrew item, especially if you're first starting out building them.
Oh, good point.
Figuring out a good place to put it in, because you can create a really cool thing and then give it to them way too early and they just slaughter through half the campaign because you gave them an item that was way too strong.
Yeah, I'm sure that's tricky.
People have created items that awaken over time. So when you find it, it might just give you a +1. But then if you meet certain requirements or attain a certain level, it becomes more powerful. And the items grow with you, which that's a fun idea that I really like too.
Yeah.
I haven't implemented one yet, but I really, really like that idea.
I think that's nice. Yeah, that kind of helps solve the problem. Getting a magic item at a low level that might be perfect for that level, but then like growing out of it, and it might be something you were quite fond of.
Yeah. So summing up today's episode, magic items are a fun and interesting part of the game. Whenever a character receives a magical item, it can become a really fun and empowering thing as a player. It adds a bit of excitement to your game, and it becomes a point of conversation. I don't think I can name a player that I have met who doesn't have a story that begins with, oh, one time I had this magical thing, and it did these other things, and you just kind of get the ball rolling with storytelling and swapping it, almost like old war stories in a weird kind of fantasy way. They create moments in the game where everyone goes, ooh, and the table gets a jolt of excitement or terror. And I think it is really important that those moments are the ones that we latch onto and remember as we play these games, because it's about building those connections and those bonds and those memories together around the table. And questing after magical items, or the pieces to make a magical item, or questing to destroy a magical item, overcoming these obstacles is an important part of the game. And even if it's just a magical item you bought at a magic store, using it to do something really cool creates a memory that we remember as players and as a dungeon master, and it just helps make the game fun and keep it interesting, and I'm all about that.
Likewise, I'm going to always think of that tent and the hour in game we spent opening and closing it as a party, discovering this magical thing together. It's just, I don't know, it's little stories like that yeah, you're going to remember. It's not a flaming sword. It's a tent that turns into a backpack that turns into a tent. But it's cool.
Yeah.
That's the kind of creativity I like to see in homebrew items that are, kind of gifted. I feel like they're like little gifts to the players, and the DM's got something clever. Creativity can be really important here if you want to homebrew your own stuff. But if not, there's a whole guide onto how to incorporate magic items into your campaign for starters.
Not only are there guides to creating magical items in the Dungeon Master's Guidebook, there are countless other sources. There are plenty of YouTube channels that talk about it, plenty of professional D&D players or dungeon masters, and there's always Dungeon Masters Guild or any other resource that you can think about. And there are communities online dedicated to tabletop gameplay. Look into those if you have a question. Maybe you're playing in a campaign and you really want something cool, but you don't want just a +1 sword, or you don't want a cloak of billowing. Maybe you're a dungeon master. You want to reward your players with something cool to keep them interested and keep them excited, but you don't want to give them something that's going to break the game and make your job to challenge them more difficult. Plenty of options for that as well.
Yeah, looking to other resources is a great idea, and you might find somebody's already homebrewed and tweaked and balanced an item that they put up for people to use, and you can say, hey, okay, here's a starting point. I'll use this idea somebody's got and run with it.
Yeah, D&D Beyond actually has a whole homebrew section on it where you can look at things that people have posted online, and a lot of them, in my opinion, are very overpowered and not super well balanced, but that's okay, because you can just take inspiration from them and tweak it to suit your needs or what you think the item should do. Or use it as a base to create an entirely new item. I fully admit that those dice that I created, I was inspired by someone else on D&D Beyond.
That might be the easiest way to homebrew a magic item, maybe, is to start with something like the tent, for instance, where it's a utility item that, like you said, is not game-breaking, but it's fun and useful to your party. It's like a good little reward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for joining us on this adventure. Come back next week where we will be talking about class options. Remember to check out our friend and the composer of all the music used on Mid-Level Adventurers, John D. Ivy, on SoundCloud.com. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at MidLVLAdventure.
And please check out our website on Wix at midleveladventurer.wixsite.com. And feel free to email us at midleveladventurers@gmail.com. And watch Jarrod and I on Newly Forged, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern at twitch.tv/newlyforged. That's NUULIFORGED.
I'm Jarrod Jehoda.
And I'm Matt Morris.
And until then, mind the traps and keep adventuring.